Good afternoon, everybody. Hello. My name is Dr. Warren Doctor, and I'm the president of the East Tennessee Historical Society. And I would like to welcome everyone here. This is a very special day, not just because of our speaker, but because this is our inaugural talk this year for our brown bags, which we're very, very excited about. So I would like to thank you all for coming and being a part of this. The second thing I'd like to do is just mention that if you're not a member of the East Tennessee Historical Society, you can pick up a brochure by the door on the way out. I like to encourage everyone to join the society because it's through your contributions that we're able to put on these types of programs. So we're very, very excited. I should also mention that our next brown bag lecture will be Professor Carol Van West, who will be speaking on the 11th of April at noon, and he will be he will be talking about how we're going to move forward with the celebrations for the 250th, the anniversary for the creation of the country. So if you're interested in discussing how planning and what we're planning on doing around that event is going to go, I would advise everyone to come listen. He and I have been working closely together on the 250th Commission, and we have special plans specifically for Tennessee because, as you all know, Tennessee and specifically East Tennessee played such a major role particularly at the Battle of Kings Mountain in the American Revolutionary War. But I'm going to talk a little bit about our distinguished guest today, which is a real honor for me to introduce John J. Duncan. He's originally from Lebanon, Tennessee, and he moved to Knoxville and graduated from Holston High School. He got his B.S. in journalism at the University of Tennessee, which is also my alma mater, so we shared in many things. And then eventually got his law degree from George Washington University National Law Center in Washington, D.C. In addition to his career and his academic training, he was Congressman Duncan was also a member of the Army National Guard and worked his way up to being a captain before he retired from that in 1987. In 1973, Congressman Duncan established a private law practice here in Knoxville with Zane Daniel. Now, I don't know if you all know me, but I'm from Granger County, and so Zane Daniel, Creed Daniel, and in all the Granger counties, major players, he's sort of a celebrity where I'm from. So we're very, very happy to have him here. He was appointed as state trial judge by Tennessee Governor Lamar Alexander in 1981, and he served in that capacity until 1988, when he was elected to Congress in a special election to fill the vacancy of his father's seat. And he has served in that capacity from 1988 all the way to 2019. So we're very, very honored and privileged today to have Congressman John J. Duncan. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Doctor, and I do appreciate that kind introduction. And I've always said that I need to be introduced. I've told this story before that. Several years ago, I presented a flag to the school children at Rogers Creek Elementary School in McMinn County, and to all the kids out in front of the school. And then one of the second grade teachers asked me if I would stop by her class, and when I walked in, she said, "Boys and girls, do you remember who this is?" And I'd just spoken to him out front, and this little fellow raised his hands in kind of a nervous voice. He said, "Are you the man on the nickel?" And so I explained I was not the man on the nickel. But and then I've been so blessed in so many ways in my life. But one of the greatest things that ever happened to me was when I went into law practice with Zane Daniel, and he was from Granger County, and it was just the two of us. We called it Daniel and Duncan, and for many years our first secretary left us after a year and a half to go back to UT, but then she called and told us that she had two beagle pups and had named them Daniel and Duncan. And for many years I said, well, all these other politicians have schools and highways and different things named after them. The only thing I have named after me is a dog that's now dead. And, but they didn't name a couple things later on. But I had a fascinating law practice and a fascinating judgeship, and then a fascinating 30 years in Congress. I had 16 years as a lawyer and a judge, 30 years in Congress, and so that's 46 years, and it passed by so fast. 9 or 10 years ago, my wife and I we still have a place in West Knoxville, and I'll tell my friend Ed Schaus that I still vote in Knox County, but we moved for probably a little bit over half my time to Granger County, and I love it up there. My wife loved telling people that we had moved to Mayberry, and some of the people in Washington, when I got near to my retirement, they got a big kick out of the fact when I told them that in Granger County there's only 2 stoplights, and that's all. And so it is kind of nice. So we have a house halfway or right in the middle between Bean Station and Rutledge, but it's got a Bean Station address. And Coach Hugh Watson, who was the former basketball coach at LMU, but he had coached in Hawaii and in Idaho, and she said she told this woman friend of hers from Idaho her new address, and when she told her Bean Station, said that woman friend of hers says, "Oh, that is so cute." But anyway, my book has it's not a long book. It's about 160 pages. It's about half serious and half humorous. It's got 203 stories or vignettes about my entire life, even some of my early jobs. Got some sports stories in there. Ed, I know, is like me, a baseball fan, and the title came because I was a Batboy for the Knoxville Smokies for 5.5 seasons. And I don't believe, I've told people I should be in the Hall of Fame. I don't know of anybody that was a Batboy that long. But I did it because the first season and a half I did it for free, and the next 4 for $1.50 a game. And I don't know anybody that would have done it that cheaply. But several years ago, I was speaking, there was a Chamber of Commerce dinner in Athens, and they'd gotten Pete Rose, the famous baseball player, as the main speaker, and I sat by him at the head table. And I told him that I was Batboy for the Knoxville Smokies when he played for the Macon Peaches. And I probably was 12 or 13 at the time, but when he got up to speak, the first thing he said, "Congressman Duncan," he said, "I wish you were a senator." Because he sort of liked some of my views, and that was nice. But then he said, "But you were 9 years old when I played at Macon." He said, "What the hell happened to you?" He said, "I thought I was sitting next to Colonel Sanders up here." Before I go any further, though, I have to tell you, another blessing of mine is that I probably had less turnover than about any other member of Congress, and I had some of the most wonderful people who worked for me, and to whom I owe a great debt of gratitude. And the number one is back here. Bob Griffiths was my chief of staff. He was with me the whole time. Bob was a veteran of some of the worst fighting that went on in Vietnam. To me, he is an American hero, but he was on Hamburger Hill. But I will tell you this. My first campaign for Congress, the Washington Post, I think it was, had a story that said the campaign against me was the most negative in the country that year, and it was really negative. And it was so bad that I told my mother at one point, I said, "Mama, if I had $1 million I could pay to get back in my judgeship, I'd do it and get out of this race." But it was so bad that Bob and I were crossing the street. I still remember exactly where we were. We were crossing the street, having just walked out of the old post office. And Bob said to me, we'd been had been and still are such close friends, that he was taking all these attacks against me personally. And he said, "This is the worst thing I've ever been through." And I said, well, Bob, you went through some of the worst fighting in Vietnam. He said, yeah, but it wasn't this bad. And also seated with him is Caroline DeBerry, and she was with me at the tail end of my career, the last 3 years or so, and she was my healthcare person, and healthcare was a big, big thing in that time, Obamacare and all that, and just did a wonderful job for me. And she wrote up the nicest thing. She wrote up, if you do get my book, you'll see a real nice foreword that she put in there to me. My book has stories. All the stories are true. I have stories about, you'll find out what the worst job in Tennessee is. I've said the UT Press, I'm sure, and Tom Post, the fine marketing man for the UT Press, is back here. I'm sure that UT Press has never published a book before with a story like Sex on an Airplane, or Desperate Housewives, or Wrong Body, or Honest Gambler, or I've got a story about Hazel Davidson, who was the famous madam here for so long. She was on trial in my court one time, and I got a story about my first and only bribe. I'll tell you, I'll just go ahead. I don't want to tell you too many stories from the book because I want you to buy it. I get almost nothing out of these books. I don't even know. I think maybe 5% if I'm lucky, but most of it goes to the UT Press. Or today, if you buy it, you get a 10% discount by being a member, and the money would go, or some of the money would go to the History Center. But in one of my early days as judge, I got a letter from this woman. I was criminal court judge, and they had a man coming back before me who several years earlier had chopped his wife's head off with an axe and had been committed to the Lakeshore. I saw some pretty bad stuff now. But anyway, chopped his wife's head off with an axe and been committed to Lakeshore, and he was coming back before me because the psychiatrist said he was well, and the issue was whether to release him or not. I get this real long tearjerker letter from his mother telling me all the problems this man had as a boy and all this kind of stuff. But when my secretary opened it up, a $20 bill fell out of it. And at the bottom of this letter it said, P.S. Enclosed is $20 for one free meal for you and your wife at Duff's famous smorgasbord. Which I suppose is that woman's idea of a high-end eating place. But anyway, I took the $20 back and gave it to my secretary, and I said, I want you to be my witness that we've sent this back. You'll find out what I said on Oprah Winfrey. I think you would get a kick out of that. I tell about the time that I was offered several $1 million to run for the Senate and why I turned it down. You'll find out Dave Thomas's advice about toilet paper. I'll just go ahead and tell you that story. I love telling these stories. But anyway, Dave Thomas, who was the founder of Wendy's, got his start at Regas Restaurant in Knoxville. And Bill Regas came back to speak to a big Chamber of Commerce luncheon here one day. And unfortunately, the only part of his speech that I remember was that he said he had just come back from a trip to Russia. And he said, if you ever go to Russia, you need to take some toilet paper with you because they don't believe in it like we do. Well, 2 or 3 days later, I was at the Knoxville airport getting ready to fly back to Washington, and there was a group of men, about 8 or 10 men from the Knox County Association of Baptists, who were getting ready to go on a mission trip to Russia. And I told them what Dave Thomas had said about that toilet paper, and I could not be a witness against any of these men because I can't swear that they stole the toilet paper, but I did see several of them heading to the men's room just after I told them that story. And I have to read you part of this. One of my favorite things in the book, I had a little boy from Knoxville who sent me an email one time, and on that email, and it is great, and he said to me, homework is making life at home not fun for many kids. Teachers are just giving way too much. If I get 2 million people to sign, please ban homework, ! I don't see how forcing kids to do homework is in any way helpful. And it goes on down here, he says, but it really messes with our schedules, family time, and morals. But it also seems to cause a lot of stress. Many kids these days are very troubled by homework, and it can put people in a state in which they can't recover from. And then he goes on down and he says, I recommend you limit it, ban it on Wednesdays, or just get rid of it. I'm tired of spending 4 hours a day in homework and 8 hours at school. You might as well just extend school. And that little boy and his parents were very surprised when I called him, but I was very impressed by his email. Jane Chester came in here a while ago. Now Jane and I don't know why it is that as men get older, they look worse, but women age more beautifully. And I can tell you that Jane and I campaigned together as teenagers, but she looks much younger than me, so I probably shouldn't have told you that I've known her, and we've been friends for a long time, and she was a great staffer for Lamar. And I remember one time Lamar and I flew in together on the same plane from Washington, and they were opening up a new restaurant at the Knoxville airport. And we talked to the 100 or so people that were there. And then Lamar and I were walking out of the airport afterwards, and Lamar said, I told him that Jimmy's come home this weekend and is going to go to 5 Eagle Scout ceremonies, 4 50th wedding anniversaries, and 3 churches, and said, I'm going up to Townsend to contemplate legislation. And that might have been a little exaggeration, but I really did enjoy going to all the different things. I will tell you this. The last article that was ever written about me in Congress, and it really surprised me, a reporter named Ryan Gerdusky, who I have never met and who never interviewed me. And he wrote the nicest article. I didn't see it for probably about a year after it was published. It was in an online news magazine called The Week, and one of my sons had found it. And he titled it said, The Hero America Ignored. And he wrote about my career. And number one, I'll tell you very seriously, quickly, I don't feel I was not any kind of hero. And I really don't feel like I was ignored, because I had the privilege of speaking to groups and conventions and associations all around the country, and of course thousands of times in my district. And I wrote a lot of articles for magazines and newspapers. So I don't feel like I was ignored, but he summed up my career in a way that I really liked, and summed it up better than I could have. But he said, Duncan belongs to a brand of conservatism that dates back to the Eisenhower era, one that regularly opposed both the military-industrial complex and big business. He looked out for the interests of Main Street instead of Wall Street, and voted to protect America's liberty and security at home instead of traveling the world in search of monsters to destroy. And I really like that, because in my whole life, I've kind of always rooted for the underdog in sports, and I've kind of always rooted for the small businesses against the big giants. In fact, I think too often we're governed today by big government, big business duopoly. And you'll see in my book that even Bernie Sanders liked some of my votes, because I didn't always vote. I didn't like crony capitalism. And I thought if government was going to help people, they should help the little guy, not the big giants. So I like that. But and also I evolved or changed, or whatever you want to call it. I went to Congress as a very, very conservative, pro-military person. In fact, I had even participated a couple of times in demonstrations in favor of the Vietnam War, and even one time when they closed down the law school at George Washington for a week in support of the Vietnam moratorium, that big anti-war demonstration, and I didn't like that. And I wrote to the dean of the law school requesting a refund of 7% of my tuition. And he cut me down better than anybody ever did in any letter I ever got. All he said was, "Dear Mr. Duncan, thank you for sending your thoughts to me in writing. Sincerely, Dean Kramer." And that's. But then 3 weeks later, I ended up, and I was a totally unknown law student. I ended up he had shown my letter to the president of the university, and the president of the university showed it to this big syndicated columnist, and this man wrote a column contrasting me and Jane Fonda as the two extremes, but whatever. But then later on, I became convinced that there were hardly any conservatives in the Pentagon, and above everything, I was a fiscal conservative. And it always amazed me. The public relations campaign should have been studied, that the Pentagon, that we had tripled their appropriations in a time when people were saying that the Defense Department had been decimated, and their appropriations had been tripled. And so I didn't like that, and of course I didn't go along with the war in Iraq. And I do have a thing in there about how I was called down to the White House and put in a little room with Condoleezza Rice and George Tenet and John McLaughlin, who were the top heads of the CIA. And what I told them, what they told me, and what I told them. And it always bothered me, because all my opposition to the war came because I believed so strongly in what I felt were conservative principles. And yet that war became, at least for the first 4 or 5 years, became thought of as a conservative war. And it was everything but conservative. In fact, William F. Buckley wrote those same words. He said, he told George Will it is anything but conservative. So anyway, I'll stop there and see if any of you have any questions. Or or if you want to, yes?
We so miss your newsletters.
Oh, thank you, thank you.
We felt very strongly that the way you spoke about Washington and our concerns was so clearly expressed, and we so agreed with your standpoint. So thank you.
Well, you have made my day, because most members didn't put out a newsletter, but the ones who did would fill them up with military academy appointments and ribbon cuttings and, non-controversial things. Well, if you remember my newsletter, I wrote strictly on issues, with one big exception. I usually didn't put a picture in there, but they had a picture, which is in the book, of me singing with Dolly Parton. And I couldn't resist putting that in there. And you would be surprised at how many men teased me about that and told me it looked like I was looking down at a certain location. But I'll say this seriously, I enjoyed that newsletter. I enjoyed putting it out, and I got the best reaction to that. I think if people had known how many people, and people still tell me today, and it happens to me several times a year. Now I'll go places and people say, "I miss your newsletter," and that really makes me feel good. So I appreciate that very much. Yes.
You can still read about you each week in the Knoxville Post.
Well, I should have mentioned that. Yes. Con Hunley, the singer, and his brother Steve Hunley are longtime friends of mine. I represented Steve on 3 different things when I was a lawyer, and so we've known each other for a long time. And about a year and a half ago, Con called me first, but then Steve called me and wanted me to write a letter. A column like my newsletter. Well, I said, well, I'll write mostly on national and international issues, but I said I don't want to limit it to that. And so I've had columns about Christmas memories. I did a column about Barnes Barbershop, where I've gotten my hair cut since I was 2 years old. Regas Restaurant, because I had many big things, big parts of my life happened at Regas. My wife was a waitress at Regas when I first met her, and so I ended up with my marriage coming out of Regas. Zane Daniel took me to Regas for a lunch to ask me to go into law practice with him. And then my wife had some medical problems and had been told that she could not have any more children. And then 5 years later, she took me to lunch at Regas to tell me she was going to have another baby, which turned out to be our son Zane. So I had a lot of big things happen at Regas. And my column this week is entitled "My Pitiful Basketball Career," which you might get a kick out of. But it's in the Knoxville Focus on the page, top of page 2 every week. I've been doing that for a year and a half now. I hope some people read it. And yes.
Fast forward to this morning, if you saw President Zelensky's address to our nation, what advice would you give to President Biden?
Well, I didn't get to see the speech because I was speaking to a group that I didn't even know about when I was in office. I don't think it even existed when I was in office, but a man formed a conservative club at Tellico Village, and he has about 100. He told me to have about 100 or 120 people there, and they really did have that many, but I was speaking there. But my sympathies are like everybody else. They're with Ukraine. It was a totally unjustified, unprovoked invasion, and I think Putin has made the biggest mistake, our biggest mistakes in the history of the world. I mean, he's going to go down in history now as one of the most evil men in the history of the world. Who would want that? And the whole thing has been a disaster for him and for the poor people of Ukraine. But William Taylor, one of the former ambassadors to Ukraine, I happened to see him on CNN a few days ago. I can't resist changing over to MSNBC and CNN every once in a while. I can last about 5 minutes on there with them, not long. But anyway, he said that, what he said made more sense to me than anything I've heard. And everybody has gotten so wrapped up in it. We're all experts about Ukraine. I happen to have been there twice. But you all know about as much about it as I do. But what William Taylor said, he said, Russia went into Afghanistan years ago, went in strong, and came out weak. And he said he thought the same thing was going to happen this time, except I would add this. They're going in weak, and they're going to come out weaker. And the reason I say that, I mean, I looked up, I'm still real interested in all these national and international issues, and I looked up what was Ukraine's GDP. And the year they had it for, last year they had it for was 2020, and they said 155.9 billion. That is nothing for a country that size. I mean, those people had a pitiful life before this all happened anyway. And you have to feel sorry for the people, but they also Ukraine's had a history of corrupt leadership. And but like the first time that I went in there with a congressional group, they told us that Ukraine was going through a depression at that point much greater than our Great Depression. So all I can say is Putin, and some others have said that he does not have nearly enough money to occupy that country for any length of time. But he can't do much with Ukraine. He can't do hardly anything for Ukraine. And of course now he's made it even worse by destroying everything. I would ask a lot of questions. I will say this: I think we should have been demanding that the other countries in Europe do much more, because with a $30 trillion debt, we can't carry the majority of that burden. And what I would have said, let's send our military over there to Iraq and get most of that $82 billion worth of military equipment that they left over there and take it to Ukraine. And there's always more economical and efficient ways you can do things. But it's a bad situation, and all of us are keeping our fingers crossed that it not escalate into some kind of nuclear thing. I do agree, and I saw General Keane on Fox, and he's about the most hawkish man in the world, but even he came out against a no-flight zone. So that's a few of my thoughts. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
And this gets back to what you said earlier. Is there any way we can get big business out of our election process? Is that possible today?
May not be possible, but if you read my book, you'll find out that I was a big admirer of Harry Baker, and he always advocated this position that nobody could take a contribution from outside their state or outside their congressional district. And I always thought that he was a good man who had a lot of common sense, so in fact, I told the people this morning, my first year in Washington, a lawyer who died at a very young age, John Hogan, he was a big golfer, and he wanted to play golf at Burning Tree Country Club, where Eisenhower played all the time. And I was not a member. I didn't play golf in Washington, but John Corcoran, who grew up in Knoxville, I knew him, and he happened to be a member, so he got us on the course. It was a cold October day, and the only other people we saw on the course that day turned out to be Tip O'Neill, the former speaker, and a former Democratic congressman from Pennsylvania named Fred Rooney. And when Fred Rooney when John Corcoran introduced us, Fred Rooney said to me, he said, "Your dad was the only man I ever knew who never had an enemy in this town." And I was very proud of that. I thought that was one of I've heard a lot of compliments about my dad, but that was one that I really appreciated. And I told the people this morning, I learned my politics mainly from my dad, but also from a lot from Senator Baker, because he was a good friend to me and our family. And I tried real hard the whole 30 years I was in office to get along just as well with the Democrats as I did with the Republicans, and I believe that I did. And I felt that I had to because 16 of my 30 years, the Democrats had the White House, which meant that they had all the departments and agencies and so forth. And now for the last 3 years or so, it seems like everybody hates each other almost. But go back to the first part is the way I answered your question. I like that, and it shocked people. In fact, I think most of them probably didn't believe me. But I hated, and poor Bob Griffiths back there can tell you, I hated to. I never, not one time in 30 years did I ask somebody for a campaign contribution, because I hated to ask people for money. Now, having said that, what we did, we sent out invitations for luncheons or breakfasts or whatever, and I always thanked the people that came to it. But they used to tell me, they said, you could raise 3 times as much money if you would call up these people personally. But I just didn't want to do it. And fortunately, because of all the campaigning that my family did for me, and that I tried to never miss a vote, but I tried to spend a tiny bit more. I spent a tiny bit more time here than I did up in Washington. So I ran some of the cheaper campaigns that anybody could run. There's a story in my book. Harry Baker tried to get my dad to run for the Senate, and he told Daddy that he said, "John, if you run for the Senate, you'd only have to run once every 6 years." And said, my dad told me, said, "Yes, but if you do a good job in the House, you should only have a tough campaign about once every six or 8 years." And then he said, Howard Baker told my dad, said, well, you could sure raise a whole lot more money if you ran for the Senate. And said, Dad told him, said, yes, but I wouldn't want to spend it. And I got some of that. I got some of that for me. I'll tell you another thing that amazes people. There is more turnover in elective office today than anybody knows or believes. And do you know that even I'm surprised at this, but in my 30 years in Congress, I served with almost 1,500 other members. And unless you're a political junkie, you probably couldn't name 50 of them. Because the typical House member, unless they become Speaker or unless they're involved in a scandal, you know, they just don't. Most of the publicity went to Jane back there, her and the senators.
What was it like growing up as a congressman's son and then becoming a congressman for your family?
Well, when I grew up, most of my growing up time, my dad was a lawyer and then mayor of Knoxville. And that's what I remember the best. And I hated that in a way because I loved my dad. I worshiped my dad. But for instance, I mean, I'll give you an example. I had the meanest English teacher that anybody could have ever possibly had at Holston, Mr. Myers. And he had this box of pencils on the corner of his desk that was sharpened, and if somebody came in without a pencil, they could go up and borrow one. Well, I went up to borrow one day, and he stood up in front of the whole class, and I was so bashful that he stood up in front of the whole class, and he said, "Fine, Duncan, fine," says, "you can borrow a pencil," says, "pencils are just $2 for a nickel," and says, "your dad's just mayor of Knoxville making $15,000 a year, and I'm just a lowly school teacher making $5,000 a year, but you can borrow a pencil." And I don't know, I didn't really like being called the mayor's son. I loved my dad, but then what happened? I started going with my dad all these places. It's like, you know, when I got to UT and different things, and slowly but surely the politics gets in your blood, and so when I got elected to Congress, it was really a dream come true for me, and I was so grateful. Not one time while I had it in that 30 years was I not thankful for my job. Anybody else? Yes, Carolyn?
I think all of us appreciate you serving on the aviation committee and the
Yes.
things you did for the Knoxville Airport.
Well, I really enjoyed that, and thank you for saying that. I got to chair aviation. I got to chair highways and transit. That's when we got most of the interstate in West Knoxville done, and a lot of other. We got to, at one point we were getting more highway money in here than just about any congressional district in the country, and I was real pleased about that. And I chaired the Water Resources and Environment. So we had a 6-year limit on chairmanships, so you could only do it for 6 years at a time. But aviation was probably my favorite, and that's when we got the money to redo the Knoxville Airport, and so I was pleased about that. Yes.
I was going to ask what you miss the most about Washington, or do you miss anything about Washington?
Well, if you read my book, you'll see that I say in there that I loved every job I ever had at the time I had it. In high school, I was a bag boy at A&P. I thought A&P was a great company. I thought about making my career with A&P. Then my first 2 years at UT, I became a salesman at Sears. I wore a suit and tie. I thought that was a sharp job, and I thought about making my career with Sears. And then when I was a senior at UT in 68 and 69, I became a reporter for the Knoxville Journal. I thought that was a cool job. And then I look back and I think, well, AP's out of business. Sears is almost out of business. The journal went out in '94. But I absolutely loved my job. Now, there was bad parts or bad things I could tell you about every job I ever had. But my law practice went far better than I ever thought. My judgeship, I tried the attempted murder of James Earl Ray. My court was the only court he ever testified in. But the one part I do not miss I do not miss going to the airports twice a week and dealing with the airplanes all the time. But I told my boys one day, I said, well, every job seems like either has no travel or way too much travel. And what I miss the most, when I was in Congress, whether I was in Washington or whether I was going to all these things around here, because I'm so glad that I was in before COVID hit because of this. I mean, these last couple of years, the things I liked the best about the job, they weren't doing. You know, a lot of the local events were canceled, and then they stopped all the people coming to the Capitol, and wherever I was, whether in the district or up in Washington, I was meeting with people all day long. And now, of course, being retired and living in Granger County a lot of the time, you know, I just don't see a lot of people a lot of times. But I've always been a big reader. It used to kind of aggravate my wife that I read so much, and I had too many books. But I told her that those books were what was going to keep me alive, because I'd have to live to be about 100 to read all the books I've got. But I miss all that, you know, meeting with people all the time. That's what I miss. Yes.
Given the 30 years that you've had, do you have any thoughts about people who look and say we need term limits?
Yes, and I've got a minority position about that, obviously, because I'm not. I even gave a lengthy speech on the floor one time, and I said, if you had the kind of term limits that they talked about, people would have never heard of. And I'm not comparing myself to any of these people, but they never would have heard of Winston Churchill. They never would have heard of Newt Gingrich. They never some of the best people that we've ever had in government. Nobody would have ever heard of them if they had had to leave after 6 or even after 12 years. But I did say this. I said, if they came in with term limits, that I felt that where they're really missing the boat, they should have term limits for everybody, the bureaucrats especially, because the federal bureaucracy almost in some ways is almost more powerful than in Congress. And I hate the thought of doing term limits just on the part of the government that the people have the most say about. My grandparents in Tennessee were leaders among the poor people in Scott County, but they still were very poor. They had an outhouse behind their house, and my grandmother taught school for over 40 years over there, but that was the years when they were paying teachers $50 and $60 a month. Because of that, I guess it's partly because of my sort of conservative populist background. I can't stand wealthy liberal elitists, and I very seldom criticize people. But it is to me, it's a political science elitist type thing to limit terms, or especially, I don't like to hear let's take the politics out of this, because you're taking away the control or the voice of the people. And obviously, to me, to most people, maybe all of you, politician is a bad word. To me, it is a good word. Or it can be a good word, and it should be a good word. I guess we got time for another one? Yes, Jane?
Congressman, I'm curious how many times you got to fly on Air Force One?
I got to fly on Air Force One a bunch. And it was mainly because, I guess, of the Knoxville location. I remember eating lunch one day in the members' dining room with Congressman Dick Schultz from Pennsylvania, and he was a fine member of Congress. But he told me that, and the way it came up, I had flown on Air Force One, I think, the day before, and he said, you know something? He said, I've been here 18 years and I've never gotten to fly on Air Force One. You know, I guess he lived too close to the. But I've got a lot of stories in the book from Air Force One. But the thing that I think Bob and I got or the most surprised at or got the biggest kick out of. President Bush, the second President Bush, came to the Duncan family barbecue, and that's another interesting story, because to get that worked out, I had to call somebody named Carl Rove, who I'd never heard of at that time. Anyway, when President Bush, or then Governor Bush, came out to the march of the UT band, and he really enjoyed it. And when we walked into the bowels of the Coliseum where his limousine was, I said, Governor, you're going to carry Tennessee. He said, if I do, I'll win the election. And then I get this call just a few days before he was sworn in, and they said he still at that point would have still been Governor Bush. Governor Bush wants to be his first trip outside of the capital to be to your district, and I was really pleased. And said they want it to be to a school where at least half the kids are on the school lunch program. In other words, lower income. Well, I thought a lot of presidents had been to Knoxville. So I surprised him and said I'd like for him to come to Blount County. It's near the airport and all. And so we looked over the list of the schools, and the Rockford school qualified, had enough low-income people. I thought, that's perfect. It's just about 3 miles from the airport. Well, then Bob and I were shocked. We found the only principal in the world that would not want the president to come to his school. Because I honestly thought that even if if I was principal of a school, and even if it was a Democratic president, I would want him to come to my school, But then we found that Townsend qualified. So the principal up there, when the Secret Service asked, can you move those bleachers, he'd say, when do you want to move? I mean, he just was thrilled. And but I got to fly. It seemed like there was a story every time I flew on Air Force One, but I flew with the first President Bush, flew twice with the second President Bush. Bob didn't much like it, but I flew down with Obama. He sort of wondered whether I should do that, but I did it. And he was at one of the civic clubs I spoke to a few days ago. They said, which president did you like the best? And I said to them, and this is honest truth, I said, all of them have been real nice to me. And they really were. Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, the Bushes, Donald Trump. I know that millions of people just have almost an irrational hatred for President Trump, and a lot of people who didn't like Trump couldn't understand how, say, a conservative Christian could like Donald Trump. But what they were not realizing was it wasn't the man, it was the policies. And the policies were more important than the man. But they were all very nice to me, and I got to fly with all of them. I did turn down, I had a good relationship with President Clinton, but I turned him down one time on flying for Air Force One, and the reason was that I really was invited in that case because I was one of the last holdouts on the NAFTA vote. And so I was getting calls from the president and the cabinet and all that kind of stuff. And so I talked to my Uncle Joe, and he said, well, how are you going to vote on that? And I said, well, I think I'm going to have to vote for it. And and that's one vote that I end up really regretting, because I personally was opposed to that. But I felt and Bob and others had told me that it was a majority of people in our district that were in favor of it. And there were good arguments both for it and against it. But anyway, I ended up reluctantly voting for it. What Uncle Joe said was, said if you're going to vote for it, said then you fly, and then it'll look like you've caved to the pressure from the president and all that. And so I didn't fly with him. And I did later co-sponsor a bill to renegotiate NAFTA. And I did always think that we were not tough enough on our trade policies. And you'll see if you read my next column is about the next week in the Focus is about the casual dress thing has gone too far. And I said, I believe that these foreign countries are just can't believe that we pay extra money for jeans with rips in them. That's one of our big trade policies. Yes.
I don't mean to extend it, but
that's all right.
From your point of view, how can you create a 1,000-page bill? I mean, literally. I mean, that's just that's out of our comprehension, my comprehension. They
did it every time, and they did it again here last week. Congressman Burchett called me a week ago Monday, and had come out of a meeting and wanted to know, he wanted to talk to me about this latest $1.5 trillion bill, and I was very pleased that he voted against that. But I told him, I said, you'll find out that hidden in that bill is all kinds of junk. And I will never forget one time they had a omnibus appropriations bill that they said was a 4,000-page bill written in the dark, and they even had pencil marks in there where they changed some things at the very last minute. And in that particular year, it was at the top headline of the Sunday paper that I was one of 37 that had voted against the bill and 15 in the Senate. And my wife, I remember, she said, well, she was going to be embarrassed to go to church that Sunday because they played up that vote. But then 2 days later, and this was before CNN went left, they had a feature on there from a pig yard showing pigs oinking, and it listed a bunch of these just terrible things, ridiculous, wasteful things that were in there. And I can tell you that if everybody had voted the way I had when I was in there, we wouldn't have hardly any debt. But that's the way they get in there, though, because they put stuff in there. They'll put projects in there. But I found out that if you tried hard enough to get along with people, that even if you voted against some of the appropriations bills, that you still could get some of the money through the bureaucracy or through other ways. And in fact, I have it in the book. One time, this congressman from Texas, Michael Burgess, he said to me, he said, Jimmy, how do you get so much in these appropriations bills? Because I guess he knew I was voting against most of them. And I said, well, it's not right and it's not fair, but it's based on looks. And every time in the hallway, I mean, I guarantee you, if I walked by him in the Capitol today, he'd say to me, he says, it's based on looks, huh? Well, thank you for listening to me, Hubert. Good to see you. And I'll tell you what. I had one of my columns a few weeks ago. I told how that my dad ran 3 races for mayor, and he got 90% of the African American vote in all 3 of those elections. The black community in Knoxville loved my dad, and he loved them. And I was always real proud that he and I got the highest African American vote by far of any Republicans in the country. In precincts that Bush and McCain were getting like 3%. And as far as I know, I think I'm the only Republican member of Congress who was ever the Grand Marshal of the Martin Luther King Day Parade. But anyway, thank you very much for listening to me.